Now, the obvious advantage of owning a DSLR type camera or a mirrorless camera is that lenses are interchangeable, but it can get quite confusing. There are so many to choose from. So in this video, I want to walk you through some of the basics, recommend some of my favorite lenses, and try and answer that question: what lens should I buy next and why? Hi, Paul here from Photogenius. Welcome to my channel where I like to do photography tutorials. I share tips and tricks, do occasional gear reviews. So if you love your photography, please consider subscribing. This video is about lenses. Now, if you're thinking of buying a lens, maybe a brand new lens to add to your existing kit, then you will find that it can be quite confusing. For example, this lens here is a Nikon 18 to 55mm 3.5 to 5.6 G DX VR. See what I mean? Well, don't worry, I'm here to help you guys. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the basics, walking you through some of the lens options, and I've got some recommendations for you as well. We're going to be talking focal length, we're going to be talking aperture, we're going to be talking prime versus zoom lenses. Stick around. Now, lenses are generally defined by two key things: the focal length of the lens, also referred to as the zoom range, and the maximum aperture of the lens. So let's go back to this Nikon lens as an example. The first set of numbers, 18 to 55mm, that tells us what the zoom range or the focal length of the lens is. The second set of numbers are really important because it tells us our maximum aperture. This lens has a maximum aperture of 3.5 to 5.6. We'll come back to that one later. The other letters after this we don't need to worry about too much, but let's just get them out of the way. The G tells us that this lens doesn't have a manual aperture ring such as you would find in the older film lenses. DX tells us that this lens is specifically designed for the APS-C cropped sensor cameras like this D3500. And finally, VR, this is vibration reduction. This one is fairly important, but we'll talk about it later in the video. So we're going to concentrate for now on focal length and aperture. Let's get into focal length. Now, the focal length can vary lens to lens. Here we have 35mm lens, 50mm, 18 to 55, and over here 70 to 200mm. So clearly this is a measurement, and this measurement is taken partly inside the lens and partly inside the camera. Why is it important? Well, it dictates what the camera can see, also known as our field of view. Now, for this one, I think we're going to need a diagram. So here we have a top view of a camera. Let's turn this into a simple diagram showing the camera body and the lens attached. Inside the camera body we want a sensor, and inside the lens there are a number of pieces of glass called glass elements. This shows the lens at 55mm, this 18mm. So here we see the light entering the lens. As it does, the light rays converge and are recorded by the camera's sensor. At 18mm we get a fairly wide field of view, but if we extend the lens to 55mm, you'll see that that field of view will now be more narrow, and if we extend the lens once again to 100mm, the field of view will be even narrower. And once again, stepping back to 55mm and 18mm, you can see how the field of view changes depending on the focal length of the lens. So clearly focal length is something you need to consider very carefully when choosing and buying a lens, because it doesn't just dictate the physical size of the lens. More importantly, it dictates what the lens can see and what the camera is going to capture. So it's going to make a big difference to your photography. Now, coming up in a moment, I've got some lens recommendations for you if you like portraiture, sports, landscape and macro photography. But before that, we need to talk about aperture. Now, when it comes to aperture, generally speaking, most photographers are more interested in what the widest aperture will be on a lens as opposed to the smallest. So they tell us. If we go back to this 18 to 55mm lens, for example, f3.5 to 5.6, these are the numbers that tell us what is the largest aperture I can set on this lens. And the reason there's two numbers is this: if I'm shooting with the focal length at 18mm because I want a wide view, then my maximum aperture is 3.5. But annoyingly, if I zoom in with this lens to the maximum focal length, which is 55mm, the 3.5 aperture now sadly drops to 5.6. And this is typical with most zoom lenses. Now, this lens is a 70 to 200mm telephoto lens. Now, with this lens, there's just the one number, f2.8. Now, because there's one number, this tells us that this lens has what is called a constant aperture. And this means I can adjust the zoom as much as I like. the aperture will stay constant, and this is a great feature. So generally you'll find this in the more expensive lenses and the pro lenses, but also you'll find it in prime lenses, and prime lenses are really cool. I'll talk about those in just a moment. So when buying a new lens, you need to consider two things very carefully: the focal length of the lens and the aperture. Aperture is important because it affects light. If you buy a lens with a wider aperture, then that lens is going to perform better in a low light situation. Now, something else that aperture affects is depth of field. Now, don't worry if you're not sure what that means just yet. If you've seen a picture where the subject is sharp and the background is blurry, then what you're seeing there is what is called a shallow depth of field. Now, this is affected by the aperture, so it's really important. I'm going to do a video on this very, very soon. So if you're new, consider subscribing so you don't miss out. Now, the big question, of course, is what lens should you buy? Well, this was never going to be easy to answer because we all have different requirements, different things we like to photograph, different budgets. And what I want to do here is recommend to you guys some lenses that I think are definitely worth checking out. Some budget lenses, some more expensive lenses. And to make it easier, let's break it down into subjects. We're going to start first with lenses that I recommend if you want to do landscape and architecture photography. For landscapes, buildings, architecture, you want to go a bit wider. So you're probably looking at something around about 10 millimeters. Here's my recommendations for wide angle lenses. So let's begin with the 10 to 20 millimeter Nikon VR DX lens. This is a DX lens, which means it's designed ideally for the smaller crop sensor cameras, but equally will work on the FX full frame cameras. It has vibration reduction and it's a pretty good lens. And you can pick this lens up for about $280 US. If you're a Canon user, then the Canon 10 to 18 millimeter lens is worth checking out. This is the lens that I use to record all my YouTube videos with. The lens has image stabilization and a quiet STM motor, which makes it ideal for doing videos. Look, it's not the sharpest lens, to be honest. It's a bit soft around the corners, but it's good value for money at around $250 US. Now, if you crave something super wide, the Sigma 8 to 16 millimeter lens is a super wide lens that you can get for Canon, Nikon, Pentax or Sony cameras. A little bit more money at $699, but a really cool lens. And if you've got a bit more money in the bank, the Sigma Art 12 to 24 millimeter lens is awesome. They make one for Canon or Nikon. It's around about $1,600 US. Now, next up, sports and wildlife photography. Generally speaking, subjects that are not close, they're further away. If I'm taking a picture of my boy playing football, for example, I want a lens that's going to allow me to zoom in nice and close to capture the action. And this is where a telephoto lens comes in, which is the opposite to a wide angle lens. It has a longer focal length. Here's one here. This is a 70 to 200 millimeters. 200, 300, 400, maybe even bigger. The bigger the number, the closer you can get to the action. Now, something worth mentioning is this: if you're going to use a telephoto lens, shake can be a real issue. So a good accessory to buy is maybe a monopod. I'll put a link in the description below this video. Here's my lens recommendations if you like taking photos of sports or wildlife. Starting off with a Canon 55 to 250 millimeters. This is a really good telephoto lens for the money at around $300. It has image stabilization built in, which is essential when you're using a long telephoto lens, and an STM motor, so it's nice and quick and quiet at focusing. If you've got a Nikon, then the 70 to 300 millimeters will get you a bit closer to the action. This lens has vibration reduction built in, and at around $400, it's a good value lens. But if you want to get one without the vibration reduction, you can save yourself about $150. Now, if you want to get really close to the action, the Sigma 100 to 400 millimeter lens is certainly worth a look. At around $650 US, you can buy one for Nikon or Canon cameras. And my personal favorite telephoto lens is the 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 telephoto lens. I have one for the Nikon camera. It is absolutely awesome, incredibly sharp, but it is not a cheap lens at around about $2,150. Of course, Canon make one as well. F2.8 is the maximum aperture. And of course, just like the Nikon, this has image stabilization as well. Now next up is macro photography, which generally speaking means taking photos of things like flowers, maybe bugs, things that are very small, but being able to capture detail that the human eye can't see. Macro photography is incredible and it's a bit more specialist, and I'm going to do a separate video all about it really soon. So again, make sure you subscribe. Macro lenses are engineered differently to normal lenses. They normally don't zoom, so they have a fixed focal range. Here's my recommendations. So let's start with the Sigma 105mm f2.8 macro lens. Available for Nikon or Canon cameras, it has optical stabilization and at $480 is really good value for money. If you're a Nikon user, it's worth checking out the 85mm micro lens, which has vibration reduction. Nikon tend to refer to macro as micro, $550. The Canon 100mm f2.8 L series lens is a very popular macro lens for Canon users at $700. And the equivalent, if you're a Nikon user, is the very popular 105mm f2.8 macro or micro, again with vibration reduction. Now let's take a look at portrait photography. Now if you're taking a picture of a person, what you want to do is aim to use a lens that has a slightly longer focal length, usually something around 50mm or higher. Now the main reason for this is the longer focal length will help to compress perspective, which usually gives a nicer, pleasing look to the face and the features, and will also help to just soften the background. This is the opposite to a wide angle lens, which will tend to flatten facial features and distort perspective and give you a sharper background. So we're looking at something around about 50mm or higher. A very popular focal length for photographers when doing portraiture is 85mm. Here's my recommendations for portrait lenses. Now we can't talk portrait photography without mentioning the Nifty 50, without a doubt the best selling and best value lens you can buy. The Canon 50mm f1.8 prime lens is super cheap, super fun, and if you want to get into portrait photography on a budget at about $125, this is an awesome lens. The Nikon equivalent, a little bit more money at about $180, is the f1.8G. Make sure you get the G if you want to use autofocus. And as I mentioned before, the 85mm lens is really popular for portrait photographers. This one's a bit more money at $1,500, but the Nikon 85mm f1.4G is another awesome lens. A bit better value for money is the Sigma equivalent. The 85mm Sigma f1.4DG is available for both Nikon and Canon, and this is around $1,200. Now amongst my recommendations for portrait lenses, you may have noticed some prime lenses. Now if you're not sure what prime lens means, I think we need to clear this one up. Most lenses have an adjustable focal length, 18 to 55, 70 to 200. A prime lens is a lens that doesn't zoom. It has a fixed focal length. Now, what it lacks in zoom, it more than makes up for in aperture. Take for example this lens here. This is the Nikon 35mm f1.8 prime. So no zoom, but 1.8 is considerably wider than the kit lenses. Next to it, the very popular Nifty 50, which is the Canon 50mm f1.8 prime. Again, f1.8, really wide, meaning great in low light, but also great for blurring backgrounds. Really popular. Now sometimes prime lenses can be incredibly expensive, but if you shop around you get some real good bargains. Here's my recommendations for prime lenses. Now I'm going to recommend to you 4 budget prime lenses you should check out. First one is the Canon 50mm 1.8 or the Nifty 50. We spoke about it just now because it's a very popular portrait lens at about $125. There's not many lenses that can beat it for value for money. But if you are really on a tight budget, the Yongnuo 50mm is also worth checking out. It is a copy of the Canon. It's not as good, but for $60, it's a pretty good starter if you're looking for a cheap prime lens. I did a separate video on it. Make sure you check it out. Next up is the Nikon 35mm f1.8G, so a bit wider than the 50mm, which I like. Nice wide aperture. I've used this lens quite a bit, about $180. And finally, another Canon lens to recommend, the 24mm f2.8 lens. This is also known as a pancake lens because it is so tiny. You can pick this up for about $100. So if you're looking for a good little prime with a wide aperture but a slightly wider field of view, check out the 24mm. So I really hope you've enjoyed this video and it's cleared up some of the mystery around different lens types and in particular focal length. If you've enjoyed the video, please give us a thumbs up, consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget you can leave your comments, suggestions and questions down below, where you'll also find links to all the lenses that I've mentioned in this video. I hope to see you again sometime soon. See ya. Bye.